great. Okay, well, look, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Really excited to share with you the State of the Edge report from 2021. It's my great pleasure to join you with Matt Trifiro, my co-chair. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Jacob.
All right, so a couple reminders before we get going is that we are happily accepting questions. They will only be available in the chat, so please do just type them in as you go. We will take them at the end or as it makes sense during the presentation. But please, all questions are welcome. Feel free to ask away. You won't be able to do them with your audio, so just make sure they're in the chat. Okay. And after this webinar will be available on the LF Edge YouTube channel. So if you need to bug out for a little bit or come back and forth, you'll be able to get a recording later. Very good. All right, so let's kick it off. So first of all, a couple quick logistical things. What we're going to cover today is a bit of introductions and then background on the State of the Edge. We'll dig into the areas that we researched as part of the report, and then go ahead and talk through sort of the way that our vendor neutral and collaborative report, took a pulse on the State of the Edge over the past year, and mainly what's going forward over the next year. So we'll dig into a few of the results, especially around the 4 or 5 topic areas that we covered from the research. Okay, so introductions. Very happy to be with you. My name is Jacob Smith. It's my pleasure to co-chair the State of the Edge working group on the research side of the house this year and help to produce the report with really an awesome team. My background is in the bare metal space. I currently serve as VP of Bare Metal Strategy and Marketing at Equinix. And so get to spend a lot of my time with data centers, but also with developers and with the ecosystem of software, which is really important to my career, but also to this report. I'm calling you from the edge. I live in Vermont. And so if you know what it's like to do days full of Zoom meetings at the end of a 2,000 meter copper wire, that would be my pleasure as well. My co-chair is Matt. Matt, introduce yourself, would you?
Yeah, hi. I'm the co-chair of the State of the Edge, and I'm also the chief marketing officer of the Edge infrastructure company Vapor.io. Been in this technology industry for quite a while, and I am in love with the Edge and this community that's building it. And I live in the center of the country, pretty much, just north of Dallas.
Cool, excellent. And what's this thing about kimchi? I just got to know about it.
So I do have this like weird passion for kimchi because I discovered it's not just one thing, it's like hundreds of things, and it's very competitive in Korea. And so it's basically pickled and fermented vegetables and other things that are amazing. If
limitless canvas, huh? That's great. Cool.
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, look, it's always fun to do these with you, but we're going to dive in and hopefully give some benefit to the audience here about more than kimchi, although we might need to come back to that at some later point. So why we're here today is we want to share with you the 2021 State of the Edge report, which is our 3rd annual edition. Super excited about it. It's available for download at any time for free at stateoftheedge.com. So feel free to grab that or any of the previous reports. For context, we've done 3 annual reports as well as 1 special report, which we'll talk to you about a little bit later. This is the first report that we've published under the auspices of the Linux Foundation, specifically the LF Edge, which has been a fantastic experience. So we'll talk to you a little bit about that. And like I said during the agenda, like this is all really driven through a vendor neutral and collaborative community-led approach. So that's the genesis of both the State of the Edge overall, but specifically this report that we're going to talk about today. All right, so let's go ahead and hand it off, Matt, to you to do a little bit of background on LF Edge and the State of the Edge from a project perspective.
Yeah, sure. So the Linux Foundation created LF Edge, which is an umbrella organization within Linux Foundation last year. And it already has dozens of members and many projects. This diagram you're looking at here is actually pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at the bottom, you can see that the edge has a pretty sophisticated definition and also a recognition that there is no one edge. So it spans from, on the far left, these these very constrained embedded devices, and all the way to the right, the centralized data centers, recognizing that each person's edge might be a little bit different, and it actually spans this entire continuum. But at each of these potential locations on the spectrum, there are trade-offs. And there's sort of this balancing point at the last mile, which I think is a very important sort of demarcation point. So the Linux Foundation has developed this taxonomy and has begun to advocate for it and to help people understand what we're talking about when we're talking about, so that we're all using the same language to do that. And as you can see, that the different Linux Foundation projects, including the State of the Edge, which is one of the founding projects, are all operating in different areas of the spectrum. Here's just the wall of logos. A lot of really key companies that are innovating at the edge or taking advantage of the open source capabilities at the edge. And I encourage you to go visit the LF Edge website to find out more about participating if you have that interest.
Absolutely. Great. And why don't you give us a little background on the State of the Edge project and report specifically?
Yeah, so Jacob and I kind of hatched this idea back in 2017, where we recognized that edge computing was hugely important, but also kind of chaotic. And we identified an opportunity to produce a vendor-neutral report. We found some companies to help fund it, ARM and Ericsson and folks like that, and we produced this vendor-neutral report that we published for the first time in 2018. And at the same time, we also published the Open Glossary of Edge Computing, which was basically a GitHub repo with all the words that we used in the report with canonical definitions that we created around it. And the idea is that if we use a common language, we'll take at least the important discussions of edge computing out of the realm of marketing and into the realm of like actually advancing the technology. And we approached the Linux Foundation, and they really liked the idea of having the Open Glossary be an open source project. And then over time, and this was actually when they founded the LF Edge, they invited the entirety of the State of the Edge to become a Linux Foundation project. So we conveyed all of the assets to Linux Foundation and adopted their governance model. And so now State of the Edge, including the Open Glossary of Edge Computing and the landscape, the edge computing landscape, and the research are the three working groups within the State of the Edge project under LF Edge.
Great. Yeah, I think you just covered a little bit about what we're going to have some slideware on. I wanted to make one comment though about it. I had a really funny interaction yesterday at my company where one of the developers, like popped up in a Slack channel and said, "It's so funny. I was searching for a term about edge or wireless access or something like that just to learn more about it, and it led back to this, to the Open Glossary, and then they saw the source and they're like, oh look, one of my colleagues helped to do that, and it was with Ed who had helped with the original GitHub work back in the day." And I found that really gratifying to see, like, hey, we're creating that feedback loop and also that sort of resource that does help to provide a literal common language for us as we build as an ecosystem at the edge. Cool. So I think that we touched on this briefly, but the background is important, but more important is what we're working on sort of now. And so as a project, we do have open governance, which is super important, and the various aspects of the State of the Edge kind of live in these working groups. So this is a shameless plug to get involved, because the working groups really, thrive and depend upon, volunteer participation like any other open source project. And that's a little different for a lot of, state of the X reports, right? State of, whatever reports are often, produced either by individual companies for marketing purposes, or by individual research groups. And in this case, I think we have a unique construct that is open source, and as such is really driven by those who show up and contribute their energies. So this particular report was developed by the research working group, but we also have the Edge Landscape, Open Glossary of Edge Computing, and Edge Taxonomy working groups, which all really are active and evolutionary working groups that inform our project. Great. So let's go ahead and dive into the 2020 report. And the most important thing for me Like I just mentioned, it's it's a collection of people. Matt and I are lucky enough to kind of be the face of it at times, but the 2021 report was really a team effort, which was gratifying partially because you get many hands to carry, make light work, right? But especially because it brought different voices to the room, and that's really critical to the approach here. So we were fortunate to have an editor in Charlie Ashton, whose name you'll probably see in the report, but also around the internet related to things, Edge and hardware. But we recruited then a series of 4 experts. So Simon Bisson, Mary Branscombe, Phil Shee, and our research analyst from last year, Phil from Talaga Research, came back for another stint, actually, too. And these are, key parts of helping to bring in expertise, but also different voices. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that was structured from the research areas. And then our volunteers. We had a core working group for the research group that showed up like for the last 3 months, really, and helped to produce this report. So without them and the partnership from our Linux Foundation supporters, it wouldn't be in your hands. Okay, great. So a quick review of what we studied. And this is always kind of the question when we initially get together the working group to plan a future report is what's the ecosystem need to learn more about? What are we interested in ourselves, but really what would move us forward? And so in that standpoint, we had a series of discussions and really kind of stretched our kind of, net a little bit to understand, well, what is it that we're wrestling with and what's interesting, both, from this past year, which has been a super dynamic year, and the report kind of touches on that, but also with what's going to define the year ahead. And so what we came to was these 5 different topics. The first one that stood out was really clear that everyone wanted to kind of build upon the work that we did for our previous 2020 report, which was really about a bottoms-up model around market size and growth. And so we'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, but that was really key to understand, well, what's changed? Okay, we did this big work. We did a lot of analysis and research to get to some numbers that were informative and directional. It's been a year. How's it going? Right? And so finding, an update to that was really important. The other parts were more around, well, which components of the Edge ecosystem are people looking at and where movements have been made? So the first one is around critical infrastructure, which from the original report that we did back in the day, this was a key part of understanding, like Matt said, a common terminology. A lot of this infrastructure part, like where you place stuff, really informs common understanding. But now it's sort of evolving to also be about where we share resources. It's sort of a shared infrastructure for the Edge. So we highlighted that and brought in Phil Shee from Structure Research to help us look at it. For Edge hardware, this is something that's really been, it's kind of been a fascinating year for silicon. So that kind of was on people's minds, looking at the various movements of, Intel and AMD, but also NVIDIA and ARM and other specialty makers, where hardware seems to be making more of a difference, not just in the cloud, but also especially at the edge. Networks and networking, obvious, like sort of, buzz around things like 5G that we wanted to touch base on, but also just an evolving ecosystem of software-defined networking and the physical implications of that. And finally, software, right? Which, being at the Linux Foundation, it's a little hard to avoid it in the hallway, sort of the home of open software, but also like plenty of other kinds of software, like commercial software, marketplaces. And so looking at how, we're orchestrating workloads at the edge, how, ideas like hyper-converged and sort of the experience of bringing the cloud out, that was really on top of mind. So we asked Simon Bisson to help us there. So those were the areas topics. So what we're going to do is go through a little bit of each of them, give you some highlights, and feel free as you go through to leave some questions in the chat, and we'll either stop by to answer them in real time or save them for the end. So Matt, I think it's your turn.
Absolutely. So let me dissect the headline 800 billion between now and 2028. So, first of all, the 2021 report, the size of the global edge computing infrastructure, and what we mean by infrastructure is the IT equipment and data centers required to power all the imagined edge use cases now and into the future. This model that Phil Marshall at Talaga Research built is very extensive. I mean, it's 20 tabs in a giant Excel spreadsheet, and he's been doing this kind of research his whole career. It is the entirety of the 2020 report. So the 2021 report is simply an update. And so if you're interested in really digging into how the model was built, please look back at the 2020 report, which is also available at no charge at stateoftheedge.com. And so the way this model was built is we took a look at all the regional distribution of where we saw edge deployments, and in each region, you can go to the next slide, Jacob. And in each region, we identified the use cases that would drive edge growth. And we projected the growth of those use cases as well as the computing equipment required to power those use cases and the data center footprint for those, and derived a number that became 800 billion. Between now and 2028. And that's a cumulative number. But you can see it's spread across quite a large number of verticals, from automotive to healthcare to residential, smart cities, manufacturing. And so we know as a model it's wrong, and we don't know which direction it's wrong, but it's certainly interesting to do this, and we consider it a conversation. So, some people think we picked a too small number, and other people think it's too big number, but it's an interesting discussion. Slide, Joe.
Great. Excellent. So infrastructure.
Yeah. So if you think about the internet and the cloud, you have to remember it's actually a physical thing, and it occupies physical space. And for so much of what's happening in edge computing, that makes a big difference, because you can't escape the speed of light. And a lot of times you have to have very discrete timings and things like that, so you can't rely on best effort routing and that sort of thing. So you have to be in a local region. And so a lot of what's driving edge computing and supporting edge computing is this build out of infrastructure, particularly at the edge. And if you think about what is essentially being built out, it is the same thing that powers the core of the internet. It's just now being built out at the edge. So it is data centers, although rather than being centralized large data centers, they tend to get to regional data centers, city block size instead of square mile size, and then they get to micro data centers and even like street side cabinets and things like that. So the physical infrastructure is a very, very important part of edge computing. It's highly distributed. It has to be automated because you can't afford to have people at every site. It has to be super resilient, because things happen that you need to maintain critical services. Important things like interconnection. So you think about now traffic that originates in a city, like that we're all familiar with, for example, with our kids at home going on Zoom. It doesn't make any sense the way the internet should be architected to support those applications for that traffic to leave the local region. But today it largely does. If Jacob and I are on a cellular provider and we're standing next to each other and we're sending us messages, those packets are probably being backhauled thousands of miles to some other city and then routed back to us. And because we're humans, the timing doesn't really make a difference to us. But if we were machines, it would be glacial, and bad things could happen. So we're seeing a lot of this networking capability built to the edge, data center capability built to the edge, interconnection capability, the ability for networks to cross connect and exchange data in peer. And it's really important, this emergence of sort of neutral infrastructure, because the economics of shared infrastructure are really compelling. I mean, it simply isn't the case that every telco and cloud provider can build out the edge infrastructure to support their equipment only. It's not technically feasible or economically feasible. So you do need the shared infrastructure. but also there's just not enough land. There's a space constraint that you don't have in the middle of Wyoming if you're building a hyperscale data center. So it's really important that we see partnerships and collaboration around the critical infrastructure emerge.
And I wanted to get your sense on one thing, which we didn't cover in the report, mainly because of timing. But with the various bills that have passed through Congress around pandemic relief, we're seeing a huge investment in critical infrastructure for things like connectivity and last mile and rural internet, which will be fascinating to see over the coming years. But this is the kind of building on the ground that is connecting people, workloads, opening up new opportunities, especially for some of these use cases we saw above, which are constrained by a variety of factors. One of them, probably the slowest of them, to be the critical infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, if you look at this from 30,000 feet, we're actually re-architecting the internet. I mean, the internet we built isn't the internet we need. We built it from the core out, and it worked great for delivering movies and content and Facebook and things like that. But for edge computing, for delivering real-time workloads with discrete timings and SLAs, it's not the right infrastructure. So now a lot of infrastructure development is happening out at the edge that's complementing the existing infrastructure that's been built. But it is a lot of equipment. It is a lot of buildings. It's a lot of fiber. It's a lot of electricity. It's a pretty substantial build out.
And satellites in space, right?
True. So. Yes. Yeah. That's something that's interesting, is that the speed of light through the air is actually faster than it is in glass.
What do you know? Pretty cool. I mean, we saw, early examples of that with high frequency trading and kind of, bouncing things off the atmosphere. And so it is an interesting architectural question. So I think we tap into it in the report. But like one thing that comes across with each of these areas, well, first of all, how interconnected they are, right? You mentioned critical infrastructure, and part of that, paradigm there is how to consume it. And so software plays a big role. But as we see sort of the interconnectedness of these parts, we're also seeing sort of how much activity is ramping up, right? And so I think that's, seen in the model, but you can also kind of just look around and understand, hey, look, there's satellites going up into space to help power internet and other kinds of connectivity. This is changing the shape of the internet. So look, let me grab a little bit on the hardware one. It's one of my favorite topics that I have little to zero expertise in, but maybe it's growing up at a Radio Shack and building my own PC that kind of brings back the excitement around what I think in the report kind of indicates is a really fantastically interesting time for hardware. Hardware being a euphemism for everything that goes inside, right? The technology inside the box. And so what we studied in the report was really an interesting collection of technologies that are, first of all, being made more consumable. I think that's probably the big logistical and supply chain question that we face for this part of the edge, is how to put lots of different things in lots of places. And so there's an interesting section in the report around Open19 and other efforts to make hardware at the data center level more consumable in more places, and to make that operationally and economically effective, but also different kinds of form factors, and of course different kinds of silicon. Sort of, continuing from the common, phrase of the end of Moore's law. Well, it's kind of like the beginning of something else now. And what we're seeing is some really interesting acquisitions and consolidations of technology, but also just a lot of variety, more specialized hardware or technology for use cases, which makes sense. As Matt mentioned, critical infrastructure includes things like power. Yeah, and in fact, our whole model in the report is built around the idea of consuming power and turning it into digital stuff. And as we see workloads not only get more distributed but more scaled, we see an emphasis on how to make them more efficient, cost efficient, but also energy efficient. So there's a big role for hardware to play in that, which is difficult because, as Matt said, our architecture for the internet was more built around putting things in centralized places, which logistically and supply chain wise has been proven out to be doable. Right, the thing we're seeing in the edge around hardware is that there's a lot of people working on, how to bring that out further and what kind of new models are needed. The last thing is around new kinds of. I think the report touched pretty heavily on storage, right? Data at the edge is a pretty difficult challenge, as Matt said, bringing in, how do you bring the workload and the data closer to the experience, the user, the car, the factory, and data is certainly a big part of that. It's growing immeasurably, so there's quite a lot of interesting efforts there to kind of, leverage new kinds of storage solutions and also just leverage software to make it more efficient. Matt, I'm going to hand the networks to you.
Okay. And actually, we got an interesting question that'll kind of lead into this. So Jim Baker asked, do you think that distributed computing at the consumer level, P2P, will be the best way to build out this ideal? And I imagine by this ideal, Jim means the future of edge computing that's delivering on all these use cases. And the answer is no. But let me qualify that. So peer-to-peer ad hoc networks, there's a lot of really interesting research happening there, and I think it will play a very significant role in particularly in where there's spotty or unavailable connections, but even in where there are available connections. But I don't think in any way it's going to displace or replace compute and storage that comes from the infrastructure, from the cloud, from everything that's on the other side of that. So I do think they're complementary technologies, and I don't think it's winner take all by any stretch of the imagination. So what's happening in networks? So obviously we have this pretty significant investment around 5G for these real-time wireless type activities, higher bandwidth. But we have to remember that there's a wired network that exists today that can support very, very fast, low latency connections. And so the 5G, into some ways, is really extending this to a wireless environment. But both of those are going to require having a lot of compute and storage to support these edge applications and the networking in order to do it. In fact, in many cases, the edge is more of a networking problem than it is a compute problem or a storage problem. What's really important, and I mentioned it earlier in critical infrastructure, is that there's some really powerful economic forces coming together to make a lot of this possible. One of them that's really interesting is that the 5G network infrastructure is largely virtualized. So, in the old days, you would go and buy a baseband unit from Nokia or Ericsson, and it was an appliance. It was a box. If you opened that up, it probably had an Intel server inside it, but it didn't have nobody had any access to it. And so now with a lot of these Open RAN and other types of virtualized network function innovations, what mostly runs the network, up to the point of like the RF analog components, can actually run on a white box server, and that white box server can sit in somebody else's data center alongside other people's white box servers. In fact, those servers could be owned by someone other than a telco. It could be owned by Amazon or Microsoft or Equinix Metal. And I think that just provides a really interesting convergence of the technology that runs the network and the technology that allows for applications to run that network. And so I think that a lot of that is really driving that. And then I mentioned this earlier, the power of interconnection. I mean, that the only way to keep local data local is to allow it to be cross-connected as near as possible to where it's created. In order to do that in a robust way, we believe there needs to be a lot more, open, neutral interconnection points. And so this thing that we think of the internet, which in the U.S. has like 40 interconnection points, probably should have 40,000 at some point in the future.
Yeah, and Matt, what are you seeing? Because you spend a lot of time, obviously, in your day job on this. What are you seeing in terms of the role of, obviously we talk a lot about telecoms and clouds, but what about the role of like municipalities? There's a bunch of interesting activity at the very local level. Are you guys hearing anything about that from
yeah,
an interconnection standpoint?
it's really different in every local locality. But I mean, obviously, the local governments have a huge need to automate and digitize, just like any manufacturer or so on. And so the ones that really recognize this are investing in it. The municipalities have a couple things that make some interesting partnerships. One is they have access to a lot of the real estate and the pole rights to be able to hang a radio off it and stuff like that, or to dig up a street or something like that. And they also have access to a lot of the data. Or they're going to be the ones that are going to be the sort of stewards of the data. And so, we're seeing a lot of really dynamic partnerships emerge between technology companies and municipalities, but I haven't seen any one model prevail. It's all experimental right now.
Right. Well, it'd be interesting with the infusion in state and local governments for connectivity, what kind of shared infrastructure or interconnection infrastructure kind of emerges from that. Hard to get to 40,000 places or hard to imagine at this point that we do it in the way that we saw central offices, 70, 80 years ago, come about, but remains to be seen. Cool. Well, let me take us through software, and then we'll go ahead and see what other questions we have. So software being, massive, dynamic, huge, and ever changing, it's the same at the edge. And in fact, in some ways, more so. I think that we're seeing a mixture, and the report talks to this of all the aspects of software, which is a big word when you look under the hood. So things like orchestration came out a lot in the research, which is actually maturing quite nicely. Right. So thank you to hybrid and multi-cloud kind of movement. The edge kind of has a lot of benefit there, which you see the sort of open source. So at the Linux Foundation, things like the CNCF projects around cloud native. Pushing out very rapidly to the edge in different form factors and, smaller bite sizes, but also just in sort of understanding what goes where and how and when from a programmatic standpoint. So the orchestration part, very interesting, but also pretty mature. There's a lot more inputs that we think we need. And this is something that I think we have, work to do as an ecosystem on is, when location is generally understood to be, like Matt said, 40 points, but for most people, US East, US West, maybe something in Europe, right? Maybe something in Asia, software is built around that, and it understands that kind of diversity. And so as you kind of explode that diversity and say, actually, I care a little bit more about maybe how it's performing from a latency perspective or a cost perspective, in some places versus others, and you get less generic and more specialized. The software has a major role to play in it, but also needs collaboration with the networks. Needs to understand, well, who are you peering with? How's it working back there? What's the historical performance of this? In order to really help programmatically place workloads, in the way that we see them coming about, in the way that consumers are asking for them. And that being said, things like security and overall, just like, working applications on, heterogeneous, sort of non-homogeneous hardware. Huge strides over the last few years, but even just the last year. And you can see the maturity of projects at the LF Edge, but across the Linux Foundation ecosystem and across the commercial software ecosystem, just embracing Edge as a valuable and necessary target. A couple things that stood out that were a little different. One, hyper-converged and marketplaces. I found that really fascinating. We saw a number of announcements over the last year, but big investments in how to extend the experience of core cloud, which I think most people would say they like, right? That's an ecosystem, a very rich ecosystem of partners and software solutions and tooling, and how to push that into more places. So we saw that both with marketplaces, things like what Red Hat announced with their Edge marketplace, and also, Anthos from Google with their marketplace. Lots of different ways to do it, in addition to, I'd say the more traditional, but in some ways surprising from a software perspective, hyper-converged solutions, right? As Matt talked about, there's been a movement to sort of disaggregate, from sort of magic boxes. But in many cases, that's what makes things work, right? And so we're seeing software platforms like Harvester from Rancher, but also, more kind of enterprise established companies kind of pull together various components and package them into solutions, both at the big scale, like I want to run a box, and also at the small. So I think we highlighted, a couple options in the report, like at the industrial and IoT layer, like HiveCell, which is essentially an appliance. Here it is. It works. Just plug it in. And that's kind of an interesting thing where we're seeing software and hardware being packaged up together into solutions that are specific to use cases. Okay, good deal. So I think the last thing here is really a call to action. Then we'll take a couple questions. So basically, this is a super dynamic area. I think even in just this talk today, we've kind of highlighted some things that we think are already big research topics for the coming year. Things like investment at the municipal and local level, big infusion and change in the U.S., but also internationally with satellites and a shifting internet, basically. And that's questions we need help answering. So if you're interested to get involved, or you have opinions, either things that we're missing, things that you think are interesting, the best way is to go to LF Edge and get involved, right? To come and join a working group, show up and add your voice or your company's voice. It's really appreciated. There's also a variety of resources in addition to the stateoftheedge.com, the LF Edge website, and our Twitter handle. We'll be posting, I think, something, Matt, love your perspective, but something that really stood out from last year's report that we continued this year was the postcards from the Edge. Yeah. So basically a variety of perspectives. Maybe you can touch on that, because I think soliciting more submissions there would be great for the project.
Yeah, so this was sort of a fun element that we invented last year, because we invited a lot of people to contribute, and we had too many people basically raise their hands, say we have something interesting to do. So we said, okay, well, let's do this. Let's ask people to write very, very short point of view essays that aren't vendor-y, but educate or promulgate a point of view that's interesting about Edge. And this year, we had like 30 plus submissions. And so sort of sprinkled throughout the report are these, shortish and longish postcards, quote unquote, which are written by individuals that took the time to write up a point of view and submit it. And so it is one of the most interesting ways to read the report, is to just skim through the report and read the postcards. Because I think it is because it's definitely the voice of the community. It's definitely, we didn't put any editorial blocks in front of that. We really invited everybody to contribute. Yeah. And so if you want to contribute,
and it gives us a great excuse, Matt, because the report looks huge. The report looks like you should never be able to get through it, but honestly, just flip through that.
A lot of it's postcards. Yeah, that's true.
Good deal. Good. Well, so just a reminder that you can download the State of the Edge reports, both or inclusive of the 2021 report, but also 3 other reports that are on the website for free. Please do. We'd hope to have your feedback. Now let's maybe take a little bit of time. I can't see the questions coming in on my side, but maybe Matt or Brett,
I can read them. All right, and this one's, I think, probably deserves something from both of us. So the question from Rex St. John is, if you had to advise President Biden to fund Edge infrastructure as part of an overall USA infrastructure investment package, what would be the best place to spend to support the most important use cases?
Do you want to go first? Or do you want me to take it?
I want you to go first, but I thought of an answer.
Well, so I live in a rural area, so connectivity is hugely important, just kind of like basic utilities. So I think that seems to be, a major focus. But one of the things that I think is interesting from an edge computing side is, Matt talked about interconnection, and I think open interconnection at a very localized level, on this, open source level, even OpenIX, things like that, has a huge role. And kind of, it's not going to just kind of happen, right? There's no economic reason right now for maybe a company like Equinix, which has built its whole business on interconnection, to go and operate, 40,000 smaller versions of it. But I think there's a real reason how that could spur, growth of use cases and better experiences for everyone. So there's an interesting argument to be made there that we should support open source OpenIXs in every small town. How about that?
That's a great answer. Wow, I didn't even think about that one. That is great, because you're right. The economic incentives aren't lined the same way. All right, so my answer, because I don't actually know how the government funds infrastructure, but my answer for where I think the acceleration, the catalyst could come from is if at the federal level, and ideally at the state and the local level, we spent money accelerating the digital transformation of all of the government stuff. Because, like, look, if we put sensors on the trash cans and sensors on the buses and cameras on the this and the that, we will drive the economics of those use cases. And the industry will show up with the innovations and the infrastructure to support that, in my opinion. So I think just using the power of the government to digital transformation will drive a lot of the infrastructure.
Yeah, and security, right? I mean, that's another part of it. That's like, security is a shared thing, especially when you start using shared infrastructure. We look at the utility grids, right? And how to make sure that as we kind of naturally put technology in more places, in more hands, that we understand the implications of that. Great question, Rex. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question is from anonymous attendee, and it is, what role will blockchain play at the edge, particularly for network security? All right, Jacob, take a stab.
Okay, you had me until you said network security, but I'm going to take the first part. I think that blockchain is an interesting. Let's forget about Bitcoin and Dogecoin, okay, for a second, right? Let's stay focused on how we have chains of trust and understanding marketplaces. I think is super fascinating. For instance, as we get further out with a more collaborative infrastructure, how do we understand both what it is and where it is and how it performs, but also, you think about the world in which you made a long distance phone call, right? And how many fractions of a penny were distributed among that infrastructure supply chain, right? To make that call happen. What's the model in which we can kind of see economic benefit? I'm not sure if we mentioned in the report or if I just discovered it through the report. There's an interesting blockchain-based project called Althea, which is basically an open, blockchain-powered, user-controlled network, which is all about, can I extend my Wi-Fi? Maybe in my town, but also on a, Native American reservation, or in a region that's been hit by a hurricane, or also just participate economically in it. So I think there's some interesting things on the network side there. Matt, got anything more on the blockchain side?
Yeah, so the thing that sort of captured my imagination recently is Ethereum. And I'm going to give you a very bad overview because I'm not by any means an expert on it. But essentially, you can pay a distributed something to run a workload for you. And so this idea that we would have this, if you think about back in the 80s and IBM's vision of the grid, where you create a workload and federate a bunch of resources that are available, and maybe on the devices, maybe in data centers, and, essentially with something like Ethereum, pay them to run an application. I just think it's hard for me to really, it seems so science fiction, but like Ethereum really works. So it's possible.
Yeah, no, there's examples. I mean, we launched one recently with a partner called Akash who does that. And I think it's early for a lot of these, but the idea of taking especially distinct and specialized resources that are everywhere, that are maybe localized or latency specific, and exposing them to the buyers. That's a hard problem. And I think one that we're going to face at the edge as we really look at, scaling it and monetizing it. Good question. I love it. Great questions today. Do we have any others, Brett, that came through, either through DM or public chat?
I don't see any more.
Great.
Going once, going twice.
Well, I'm sure there will be. Yeah, there'll be more after you read the report. So please take a moment to do it. Like Matt and I both reiterated, there's a lot in the report, but mainly that's because we've kind of reinforced the glossary, the postcards, and then focused on these, 5 different chapters. So it shouldn't take you more than 45 minutes or an hour to get through it. So if you have questions, follow up, please do go to thestateoftheedge.com, follow us on Twitter, or reach out at LF Edge and join our work. So
we did get 2 more questions, Jacob. We did get 2 more questions. So, and I think they're reasonably fast. So the first one is serverless or Kubernetes? And my answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I see a lot of both. And what's after Kubernetes, right? Like there's something else that's maybe even better. And so let's see, the other question is, you mentioned Hivecell and the trend of packaging software and hardware for turnkey solutions. What do you think is the most important thing for a hardware OEM to consider? You take this one, Jacob.
That's difficult. I mean, I think that first of all, that software is the consumer, so right? Making your hardware consumable, whether it's the software you ship with it or software that just works on it. And then just how do we design for an increasingly, non-homogeneous hardware world, and that to me is like
highly geo-distributed and highly heterogeneous.
Yeah, and so thinking about, when you think about OEMs, I've always thought of OEMs in addition to being organizations that sort of smooth out the bumps of implementation, they are essentially delivery mechanisms for technology, and so that technology is becoming less of a product marketing exercise and more of a everything exercise. There's such diversity in technology that I think OEMs, have a big role to play in helping to make that consumable.
All right. Well, that's the extent of this. This is a great webinar. Excited that everybody showed up, and always fun to do stuff with you, Jacob.
Always a pleasure, Matt. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your participation.
Thanks a lot.